Today at the National Press Club, the Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese. His government has been handed the most significant review of the nation's defence policy in decades, and will next month unveil its long-awaited AUKUS plans for Australian nuclear submarines. Anthony Albanese with today's Press Club address.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the National Press Club and the Westpac Address, coming to you from the lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, Canberra. My name is Laura Tingle and I'm the club's president. Before I introduce our speaker, could I just let the viewers at home know that we have just seen the Wallace Brown Young Journalist Award presented to Max Madison of The Australian, and Jess Malcolm, also of The Australian, receive a commendation. The Wallace Brown Award was established as testament to the outstanding reputation for ethical journalism of Wallace Brown, who served in the Canberra Press Gallery for more than 30 years, 1961 to 1995, as political correspondent for the Courier Mail. The late Wally Brown was respected universally for his even-handed political reporting and recognised throughout the journalistic community for his mentoring of junior members and his high level of professional skill. We are pleased that Wally's widow Valerie, son AJ Brown and grandson Eamon are with us today. Well, it's already been reported this morning that our guest today, Prime Minister Anthony Albanese, wants to talk to us about security and stability in all its forms. But he apparently wants to talk particularly about AUKUS, our new strategic alliance with the US and UK. Defence analyst Alan Beam remarked recently that AUKUS, quote, remains essentially an exercise in political theatre, lacking in both legal enforceability and a wealth of practical detail. Hopefully the PM can elaborate on what it offers us in the broad, beyond nuclear submarines, and even optimistically something more on submarines. Please join me in making him welcome.
Well, thanks very much, Laura, and I begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet. I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and I am proud to lead a government that's committed to the Uluru Statement from the Heart in full, and that will host a referendum where the Australian people will get to decide whether we recognise First Nations people in our nation's birth certificate, our constitution, and whether we agree they should be consulted on matters that affect them. I would also like to acknowledge that His Royal Highness the Crown Prince of Tonga is joining us in the audience today. I want to acknowledge my colleagues who are here: Katie Gallagher, Tony Burke, Michelle Rowland, Alicia Payne, Andrew Lee, Meryl Swanson and Dave Smith. This year, our focus as a government is on providing stability, confidence and security. Greater security in the economy, in energy and industry and jobs and wages, greater security in Medicare and childcare and aged care, in education and skills and housing, in building and delivering the infrastructure and services that Australians rely on, and in defence and national security, investing in our sovereignty, strengthening Australia's relationships in the region and securing our place in the world. After 9 months in government, my colleagues and I are fully aware of the size and scale of the problems that we inherited. Across portfolios, we are confronting a decade of national policy failures, failures which have been exposed and compounded by global shocks. The cost of living pressures Australians are facing can be traced back to a global pandemic that constricted supply chains, making it more difficult and more expensive to bring things here, but also a hollowing out of local manufacturing that meant we weren't making enough things here. Russia's illegal and immoral invasion of Ukraine has pushed up energy prices around the world, and it comes on top of years spent attacking renewables and neglecting to upgrade our energy grid, meaning that energy prices were more vulnerable to international movements than they should have been. In every advanced economy, central banks are responding to inflationary pressures with sharp rises in interest rates, meaning mortgage holders pay more. And having inherited $1 trillion of national debt, every interest rate rise increases the cost of servicing that debt. The natural disasters which have visited devastation on families and communities across our continent have also brought severe economic consequences. Billions of dollars in damage to agriculture and infrastructure, and further spikes in the price of food. In an interconnected world of rapid change, there will always be shocks. There will always be challenges to our prosperity and threats to our security. The measure of a government's performance and a nation's strength is not whether these events occur, it's whether we're prepared, it's how effectively we respond, it's what we do to protect our people and our economy from the worst of the consequences. It's also what we learn, and it's how we adapt and reform and improve. This is at the heart of our government's agenda for the year ahead. An economic agenda of relief, repair and restraint, doing everything we can to tackle inflation and help Australian families with the cost of living, building on everything we've delivered since May last year, and implementing reforms to deal with the structural weaknesses inflicted on the nation by that wasted decade of denial, delay, neglect, and a pathology of political conflict above and beyond everything else. The very day that I had the honour of being elected Labor leader, I spoke about Australians suffering from conflict fatigue. People were sick of the short-termism, the stunts and the scares designed to whip up division or create a diversion. More than that, they were tired of the government picking phony fights instead of tackling real problems. That political culture is corrosive for democracy. It feeds those who cultivate cynicism and deal in misinformation. The best way to push back against it is to demonstrate the capacity of government to deliver a real improvement in people's lives. This is why my team and I are determined to bring a greater sense of purpose to the work of government, lifting Australia out of the cycle of neglect and crisis and hurried announcement, and instead balancing urgent action with a focus on long-term reform and investment, delivering that lasting progress that Australia needs. Building greater security for our nation, greater confidence in our economy and greater stability in people's lives. This begins, of course, with the first priority and the foremost responsibility of any government, national security. Last week, the Deputy Prime Minister and I received the final report of the Defence Strategic Review. The former Chief of Defence Force, Sir Angus Houston, has described this as the most important work that he has done in defence. Quite an extraordinary statement for Sir Angus to make, given his incredible contribution to this nation. Our government commissioned this review because we recognise that we live in a time of profound geopolitical uncertainty, both in our region and around the world. We wanted an independent, clear-eyed and expert assessment of the challenges we face, the capabilities we require, and the tough decisions that we need to make to keep Australia safe. I can confirm today that before the budget in May, we will be releasing an unclassified version of the report, as well as providing our formal response. But I want to make two things clear right now. First, as I said before the election at the Lowy Institute, I can promise all Australians that our government will ensure that Defence has the resources it needs to defend our nation and deter potential aggressors. Secondly, while there will inevitably be a focus on the capability gaps we need to fill, we should never lose sight of the extraordinary service performed by the men and women of our ADF. And on that, I want to outline to you a section from the review's forward. And it said this: Australia has a strong and deep alliance with the United States, a professional defence force and defence organisation, and an enviable international reputation as a capable country in military, peacekeeping and humanitarian and disaster relief. All Australians can take pride in this, and we should take confidence from it, because with the right investments in our capability and our sovereignty, our Defence Force can be made ready for future challenges. These investments include announcing through AUKUS the optimal pathway by which Australia will operate our nuclear-powered submarines. Now, this will be the single biggest leap in our defence capability in our history. Yet AUKUS is about much more than nuclear submarines or even technological interoperability. AUKUS is about the future. It further formalises the common values and the shared interests that our three nations have in preserving peace and upholding the rules and institutions that secure our region and our world. Australia has long understood that partnerships and alliances are key to our security, and that's still true today. But we recognise that pursuing and defending our sovereign interests and contributing to regional stability requires us to build our sovereign defence capability, including advanced manufacturing. As Richard Marles has said, national security demands a whole-of-nation effort. It also presents a whole-of-nation opportunity for new jobs, new industries and new expertise in science and technology and cyber. Our collective cyber capability is, of course, a critical asset for our national security. And as if we needed a reminder, the data breaches of last year gave it to us. It's vital to protect our economy, our businesses and our privacy. And that's why next week in Sydney, I'll be convening a cybersecurity roundtable. Claire O'Neill and I will be bringing together representatives from industry, civil society, security agencies and the public service to discuss the shared imperative we all have to uplift our cybersecurity. This will be another important step ahead of the delivery of our national cybersecurity strategy later this year. Our government has shown its clear commitment to the three pillars of Operation Sovereign Borders and the important role of the Australian Border Force. And we understand that keeping Australians safe also means supporting our intelligence agencies and law enforcement agencies to guard against threats abroad and here at home, whether that be foreign interference and espionage or violent extremism in all of its forms. The shocking events in Queensland, which claimed the lives of those two young police officers and an innocent neighbour, were a terrible reminder of the dangers of violent extremism. That devastating day also underscored the importance of continuing to upgrade our national cooperation on gun reform, something that was advanced at the last National Cabinet meeting. Today, I also want to make this point. Australia's international engagement is an essential part of my government's approach to national security. From day one, we have made it a priority to rebuild Australia's standing and influence, emphasising that we work with our Pacific neighbours as partners and equals, with a shared interest and a shared responsibility to build a more secure and peaceful and prosperous region. And in the months ahead, reflecting the focus our government has placed on a family-first approach to regional security, we expect to sign our bilateral security agreement with Papua New Guinea and ratify our newly signed bilateral security agreement with Vanuatu. Through APEC, ASEAN and the East Asia Summit, we have worked to deepen our connections and our strategic dialogue in Southeast Asia, making sure that Australian companies can seize the extraordinary chance we have to be a partner of choice to some of the fastest growing economies in the world. And towards the middle of the year, I'll be hosting the Quad Leaders Summit. I'm looking forward to welcoming the leaders of three of our Indo-Pacific partners, the United States, Japan and India, here to Australia to further our collaboration on regional security and prosperity. Our government has worked hard to stabilise Australia's relationship with China, our major trading partner, recognising the value of direct dialogue, seeking to cooperate where we can, while being prepared to disagree where we must, and always acting in the national interest and in support of regional stability. In the best tradition of outward-looking, engaged Labor governments, we're seeking to build security in the Indo-Pacific, not from it. And this is where Penny Wong has done such an extraordinary job, demonstrating that Australia is back at the table as a supporter of the rules-based order, as a constructive member of multilateral forums, and as a trusted partner for regional cooperation and bilateral negotiations. But I do want to make this point. I've made it before, but it's worth repeating. The entry ticket, the threshold credibility test for so many of these conversations is our commitment to act on climate change. Upgrading our national emissions reduction target to 43% by 2030 sent a message to the world about Australia returning to the ranks of responsible nations. But the target, the number, is only the what. The safeguard mechanism before the Parliament right now is a big part of the how. It will empower business and industry with the certainty and confidence to invest in reducing their emissions. Meaningful action on climate change is our environmental responsibility, but it is also central to our diplomatic strategy, and it represents a transformative economic opportunity. Energy security is national security, and Australia can be a renewable energy superpower, powering our industries here at home to produce low emission products like green steel and green aluminium and green ammonia, and exporting clean energy, green hydrogen, critical minerals and value-added products. Energy security is a pressing global challenge. We can make it a national economic strength if we get it right. Already, 1 in 4 Australian jobs are related to international trade, and jobs in export industries pay above the national average income. We can create more of these jobs. We can grow our economy by diversifying our exports, moving up the global supply chain and revitalising local manufacturing, making our economy more resilient and our nation more secure. Securing the future of Australian manufacturing was a central purpose of the Energy Price Relief Plan that we negotiated with every state and territory in December. The temporary price caps that the New South Wales, Queensland and Commonwealth governments have imposed on gas and coal are the most significant intervention in the energy market for a very long time. But we weren't going to stand by and watch Australian families, Australian businesses and, importantly, Australian manufacturing industry be hammered by unchecked global price spikes. Since the October budget, when we first flagged the prospect of intervention, future prices of wholesale electricity in New South Wales and Queensland have nearly halved, according to the energy regulator. And as the Secretary of the Treasury, Dr. Stephen Kennedy, told Senate estimates just last week, following the December announcement, national electricity market futures prices have declined significantly. Our government stood up for Australian manufacturers. We always will. But we want to do more than just hold on to what we have. And this is where our $15 billion National Reconstruction Fund is so central. The NRF, which the House of Representatives will be voting on next month, represents one of the biggest ever investments in Australian manufacturing capacity. And investment is the key word. The NRF is modelled on the success of the Clean Energy Finance Corporation, a proven vehicle for driving an enhancement of private sector capital. Through 10 years now, every dollar invested by the CEFC has unlocked $2.60 in private sector investment, and it produces a return. The NRF will be independently run on a commercial basis, with decisions taken in the national interest, not marginal seat politics. No colour-coded spreadsheets here. Its investment mandate will work across 7 priority areas: renewables and low-emission technologies, medical science, transport, value-adding in agriculture, forestry and fisheries, value-adding in resources, defence capability and technology to support new jobs in areas like manufacturing. In the early days of the pandemic, people were shocked that Australia couldn't make enough masks or PPE for our population. It showed our vulnerability to being at the end of global supply chains. But the National Reconstruction Fund is about more than helping us produce things at short notice in times of crisis. It's about building a more resilient and more diversified economy with more jobs in regional Australia. It's about national security through economic sovereignty. National security through economic sovereignty. Our capacity to stand on our own 2 feet. Our National Reconstruction Fund will help grow and create industries over the long term, revitalising our traditional strengths but seeking out new ones, making sure that when our universities and researchers make a world-leading breakthrough, there's technology and industry here to commercialise that idea and workers with the right skills to make the product. And the NRF will help protect our economy from inflationary pressures. The Reserve Bank has made it clear that supply-side shocks account for at least half and as much as 3/4 of the inflation in our economy. Our world-class universities have made Australia a higher education destination of choice, but we can be a leader in skills and technology and manufacturing as well. Put simply, as I said during the campaign, I want us to make more things here again. And I want products made in Australia to be recognised and sought after around the world. Recognised for their quality, their sustainability, their innovative design, and the skill of the workers who produce them. Our National Reconstruction Fund will create new jobs, and Jobs and Skills Australia will identify the skills in demand for today and tomorrow. And our fee-free TAFE places will empower Australians with the skills to build a career in areas of vital national importance, including nurses, disability workers, aged care, early educators. Our new Energy Apprenticeships program, which I launched this week in Perth, will support 10,000 new apprenticeships specifically targeted at the growing demand for skilled workers in our renewables sector. And all of this will be complemented by the work we're doing to clear the visa backlog and simplify our migration system with greater emphasis on permanent residency and citizenship. Once again, greater emphasis on security. This is how it fits together. Cleaner, cheaper energy, driving advanced manufacturing in the regions in particular, and creating jobs, and then a plan to skill Australians up for those jobs. That's how. The NRF is linked to Jobs and Skills Australia, is linked to fee-free TAFE, is linked to our clean energy plans as well. It's a plan for the future growth of our economy, of taking advantage of where we find ourselves in 2023, shaping the future, not being scared of it. These reforms boost economic security for business and industry. Security for people in their daily lives also means helping Australians with the cost of living and getting inflation under control. That's our plan. Relief, repair, restraint. Relief for cost of living, the cheaper medicines that are already in place, cheaper childcare, fee-free TAFE, and energy price relief for households. Repairing our supply chains and our skills base. And restraint, the responsible budget approach that saw us return 99% of revenue upgrades to the budget across this year and next, when inflation is most acute. As Treasurer Jim Chalmers has said, we remain hopeful that inflation peaked in the December quarter and will begin to ease. Equally encouraging, wages are moving again. The fastest rate of wages growth in a decade, confirmed today, alongside the fastest rate of jobs growth in the first 6 months of any new government. Any. Good jobs and fair wages are fundamental to an economy that works for people, not the other way around. And so too are quality, reliable and affordable services. And that's why we've begun the work of strengthening Medicare in cooperation with the states. Our new urgent care clinics will be 100% bulk billed, taking pressure off hospital emergency departments. We're putting people with disability back at the centre of the NDIS. Our plan for universal affordable childcare is an economic reform that will boost productivity and increase women's workforce participation in particular, while taking pressure off family budgets. Our new Housing Accord, our Housing Australia Future Fund, the Housing Supply and Affordability Council, our Regional First Home Buyers Guarantee and our Help to Buy scheme together represent the most comprehensive federal housing policy in decades, because we believe that every Australian deserves the security of a roof over their head. Confidence, stability and security for all Australians means a growing and a productive economy, where the people who contribute to our national prosperity share in its benefits, and an economy that promotes the full, equal and respectful participation of women. This is something our government, the first government in Australian history with a majority of women members, 54 out of 103, has made a national priority. Cheaper childcare, expanding paid parental leave, implementing all 55 Respect at Work recommendations, 10 days paid family and domestic violence leave in place from the 1st of this month, and new measures to help to close the gender pay gap. These are concrete steps towards gender equality, and these are economic reforms that boost productivity, participation and economic growth. Now, my colleagues and I understand that our nation faces significant challenges. Families are having to make tough choices, and so are we, as anyone who attends our ERC meetings will be able to confirm off the record, without going into detail, of course. We're being upfront with people about this because we've seen the harm that has been done by a wasted decade of government putting off problems or just pretending that they don't exist. Equally, we recognise there are very few quick fixes here. We want to build to last, and that takes time. And yet for every question facing the nation, our opponents offer the same answer: no. For a decade in government, they created these problems, and now in opposition, they stand in the way of solutions. After a decade of inflicting low wages as a deliberate design feature of their economic architecture, they said no to increasing the minimum wage. They've said no to secure jobs and better pay. They've said no to making gender equity and job security objectives of the Fair Work Act. They've said no to helping the heroes of the pandemic by increasing their wages. After a decade of denial and delay on climate change, a decade of chaos and paralysis on energy policy, they said no to the new jobs and opportunities of renewable energy. They said no in December to helping families with their power bills. They said no to energy security for Australian manufacturing. No to the safeguard mechanism that they designed in government and that the Australian business community are crying out for them to support, to give them the certainty that they need. After a decade of hollowing out our skills base and driving manufacturing offshore, they're saying no to the National Reconstruction Fund, no to making things here again, no to 180,000 fee-free TAFE places. And after a decade of ignoring Australia's housing challenges, they're saying no to the Housing Australia Future Fund, no to the Housing Supply and Affordability Council, no to more crisis accommodation for women and children escaping domestic violence, no to better housing for veterans. No alternatives, no amendments, no compromise, no contribution. just the same relentless negativity that defined the coalition under Tony Abbott. Such a contrast with the constructive approach that we took in opposition during the pandemic, where even if we disagreed with elements of various economic stimulus, even if we sought to move amendments, we gave an assurance that they would have our bipartisan support, because we understood that in tough times we knew the responsibility we had to the nation. I want Australians to enjoy a more secure nation with more secure industries and more secure jobs, to have a better future. The Liberals want the next 10 years to look like the last 10 years. Well, you can't deliver for people if you're just trying to divide the nation. In all its forms, our future security depends on engaging with the world and shaping change. That's what drives our government's ambition for Australia. Not division and fear and negativity, but optimism and purpose and urgency. Because as I said here at the National Press Club just 3 days before polling day, unless we shape the future will shape us. And I have no doubt that Australians can rise to this moment and make this decade and beyond our own. We have enormous advantages if we're prepared to seize the opportunities that are right there before us. My government is working every day to build greater security for the nation, in our economy and in people's daily lives, by engaging in our region, by investing in our sovereignty, our self-reliance, our capacity to make things here again, by seizing the opportunities of renewable energy, by building an economy that embraces innovation and productivity, repays hard work and rewards initiative, and by strengthening the services people rely upon. This is the better and more secure future we are determined to deliver. A better future made right here in Australia. Thanks very much.
Thanks for such a comprehensive speech, Prime Minister. If I could pick up a couple of the themes of your speech. One of them is about AUKUS and national security, and the other one is about building things right here in Australia. To what extent are your conversations with the United States and the UK based on industry issues? That is, we know that there is a big interest in the UK in the potential of AUKUS for their defence industries. There are issues in the US about their capacity to supply. When you unveil the submarine deal, and more broadly in AUKUS, to what extent is there a coordinated sort of arrangement for industry policy, and what advantage will Australia get from that?
Thanks very much, Laura. That is very much the focus of all three governments. And it's a focus that recognises that it's not a zero-sum game. This is one of those times when 1 + 1 + 1 equals more than 3, because there's a multiplier effect and a benefit for sharing some of the science and innovation, and quite clearly, Australia has always, in our defence capability, engaged with our partners. There aren't too many of our defence assets, if you think about our naval assets or Air Force assets, for example, that have been developed in isolation here on this island continent. It's innovation and science and technology and breakthroughs that have occurred and then been shared with our partners. So it is very much a focus. All three countries want the sum to be a benefit for all of the three nations and have that in mind. So it's one of the issues that we've been working through. I'm very confident that when we announce what we have in mind, that people will see the benefit, not just for defence itself, but one of the things about advanced manufacturing is that it has a spin-off we've been really hurt by the car industry being told to leave Australia, because it isn't just about, was never just about a car, putting a car on the road. It was the innovation in science and research that had a multiplier impact. And so for defence industries as well, we see that as being very much a part of the story here. Yes, it's about our sovereign capability, it's about our defence, but it is also about our industry policy, about our economy, about jobs here.
Colleagues, before I ask Mark Riley to ask the next question, one question, no follow-up questions. Otherwise, Morris Riley may crash tackle you.
Well, they could ask more than one, but I'll choose which one I answer.
No.
That is
Sorry,
not how it
I'm
works.
running. One question.
Multiple choice.
No. I'm running this.
I'll give you a
Mark Riley.
multiple choice. I'll give you multiple choice of one
Never give
question.
a politician a microphone, Lloyd.
Nor a journalist. Watch out. Prime Minister, I want to just investigate the primacy in your mind, which is an admirable quality, to hold to election promises despite the impact they might have in changing circumstances. Why is it fair for low to middle income people, particularly women who have little to no superannuation, to see people on high incomes getting billions of dollars in super tax concessions at a time of an unprecedented cost of living crisis? And why, when the circumstances change, won't you change your mind and explain to the Australian people why you've done that?
Well, the average super balance in Australia is about $150,000. For women, it's considerably less than that. And so one of the things that we are looking at, and have said very explicitly, is we're looking at the purpose of superannuation as well. And the purpose of superannuation is for people's retirement incomes, to benefit their quality of life in their later years, but to also benefit the national economy because it takes pressure off the pension payments down the track in social security. One of the things that we have said is that if you look at projections going forward, potentially the concessions in superannuation will be higher cost to the budget than the age pension is down the track. Now, it is right to look at sustainability of programs. We said we would not have any major changes in superannuation, and that is certainly our intention. But we'll receive the review, the report into superannuation. We think it's important that this continue and that we do have a debate about the purposes of superannuation, to reinforce what it's there for, as opposed to we saw during the election campaign a last minute or last week commitment or promise from the coalition, one that we rejected and one that we won't be proceeding down that track with.
Michelle Grattan.
Michelle Grattan from The Conversation. Just to take up this question of the purpose of superannuation, if and when you get a definition of that purpose, a new definition, would that rule out the sort of policy that the coalition offered? In other words, would that purpose be legally tight, or would there still be flexibility for that sort of promise?
Well, that's something that preempts us receiving it and then determining how we will proceed once we have that. But I think there's to give an example as well, not just what the government, the former government said it wanted to do in that last week, but if you look at what occurred during the pandemic, where for so many people, particularly younger people and younger women, they were left with zero in their superannuation accounts because money was withdrawn. during that. Now, that was a tough time, but down the track, that is going to cost much more for those people and for their quality of life than the amounts that were withdrawn, which is why we expressed concern at the time about how that was being used. So we'll receive the report. We'll do one of the things about my government is that we, much sometimes to the frustration of some people in this room, and I understand that you've got a job to do as well, but our job is to act in an orderly fashion, to receive advice, to consider it through a proper cabinet process, and then to make announcements. And that was part of the theme I hope came through in the speech today. It is a different way of trying to frame the way that government acts beyond the sort of 24-hour media cycle, and sometimes that can cause political issues, but I think it's a price worth paying because you get better policy and outcomes if you react that way, and that's how we intend to deal with this issue as well.
Thank you.
Phil Curry.
Thanks, Laura. I'm Mr Albanese. Yeah, on super again, just a little preamble. It was in 2015 your predecessor, Labor leader predecessor Bill Shorten, declared Labor had to make the super system more equitable and more sustainable, and he proposed a couple of reforms. One was to reintroduce tax on earnings in pension funds over $75,000, and the other one was to bring the income threshold for Division 293 down from $300,000 to $250,000. Mr Shorten said at the time if Labor was elected, that's it, we wouldn't have to touch it again. The coalition won the 2016 election and went a lot further than Labor was proposing, and Scott Morrison, I think, was Treasurer and gave the very same assurance. That's right. 8 years later, we're hearing the system is still not equitable and sustainable from Labor. What do you say to people, and we're not talking people with 5 or 3 or 4 million, but what do you talk about people who are aiming for retirement and took those assurances at face value 8 years ago and kept contributing to their super? Do they have anything to worry about in terms of tax changes to their concessional rates or the drawdown rates?
Well, the last changes you're right to point out were done in the 2016-17 period by Scott Morrison when he reduced the rate for those contributions to $250,000 and made a number of changes. There were at least 4 very significant changes were made. What I have can give the assurance of is that Labor is the party that began superannuation, and Paul Keating deserves enormous credit for that, that we remain the party that's absolutely committed to universal superannuation and to the system, and that we also will be always about protecting people. And what we're talking about here is there's nothing that impacts the sustainability of the system from punters out there who've got $150,000 in their accounts. That's not an issue at all, which is the average. We said during the election campaign that we did not intend to make big changes to superannuation, and we don't.
Thank you.
Anna Henderson.
Anna Henderson, SBS World News, not on super, but on The Voice. We've heard from both SBS and NITV audiences a great interest in what treaty would look like beyond the referendum. Can you give assurances to those people who really want to see the treaty process unfold, how quickly after a successful referendum that would happen, what it might look like? I'm
focused on the referendum, the second half of this year, about a voice to Parliament. And then there will be a process of putting that in place. I want that legislation to be in place during this term. I want to reach out across the aisle about that legislation. I'll have more to say about that down the track. But that's my focus. That is very much my focus. Of course, there are negotiations taking place with state governments, but my focus as the national leader is very much on voice and on constitutional recognition. Constitutional recognition is the thing that for 122 years, if we don't do it now, when will we do it? When will we get around to it? And that is what my focus is very much on.
David Crowe.
Thank you, Laura. David Crowe from the Age of Melbourne and the Sydney Morning Herald. Thanks, Prime Minister, for your address. In that speech, you talked about structural weaknesses in the country. You also outlined a very big agenda on defence. But as we all know, the revenue in the federal budget is not strong enough at the moment to keep, well, it's not staying ahead of all the expenses that we have. Now, we can rely on coal and gas and iron ore to increase some of that revenue in the coming budget. But do Australians need to accept that this budget must include some policy decisions that increase the overall tax take to make defence, Medicare and other programs more sustainable? What's your message to Australians about the need for those decisions, even though inevitably they're unpopular?
Well, there is significant fiscal pressure on the budget, and that in part is because of structural issues that are in the budget. The pressures that are there can be brought down to defence is one, where you will see an increase in expenditure over coming years. Health, with the ageing of the population, including, to name just one, the aged care wage increase, for example, will have an impact on the budget coming through. So that is a second element of pressure. The NDIS, there are pressures on as well. And another element, of course, is the increased interest payments on the debt that we inherited that is growing as those interest rates impact not just households, but impact the national budget as well. So we'll continue to have a conversation with the Australian people about what's needed going forward. That means that we won't be able to do everything that we would like to do. I can think of a number of measures that I would like to do, last budget, let alone next budget, that it is just not possible to achieve all of that in a short period of time. What is important is that you set the country up with the sort of structural changes that I've outlined today to ensure that there is growth in revenue and in our economy as well in the future. The National Reconstruction Fund is about that. The safeguards mechanism is about that as well, about setting it up, how that all fits together. And it means as well, when we sit around the ERC and the budget process, that one of the things that we're doing, without going into specifics, is we look at, does this measure increase productivity? Does this measure enhance the economy? Is there a benefit in terms of that structural issue that is there in the budget that we inherited that was largely left basically without inaction? And that's why we prioritised the commitments that we made in the lead up to the election, like childcare, but it's also why we added in our first budget paid parental leave, because that will have an impact as well. It's why we prioritised in Michelle's area the $2.4 billion we're putting into the National Broadband Network. I was in Kalgoorlie on Monday at the School of the Air. Like, the difference that an NBN will make to people who are on station, some of whom the kids were there with their parents for their week-long sort of training camp. And it was just luck that we were there at that time. They spoke about the difference that it makes to those regional communities of having high-speed broadband for the future education of their kids, but also about the whole way that it functions. So that will be our priority as well, of how the budget fits together. But part of the message is that we are a responsible government when it comes to fiscal policy. The third element of our 3 Rs, restraint, is going to be there in evidence when Jim brings down his second budget in May.
Rosie Lewis.
Rosie Lewis from The Australian. I wanted to ask you, Prime Minister, to respond to critics who say it's been a failure of your government not to outline a preferred model on an Indigenous voice to Parliament at this stage in the debate, and whether you can clarify if you're willing to create and support funding for the yes and no cases in order to get the coalition on side.
On the latter, we're giving equal funding to the yes and no cases.
Through campaign entities?
We're giving equal funding of zero to both the yes and no cases.
So will you, any funding?
I've made that very clear. I've made that very clear. You know, let's be clear about where we're at here. This isn't a process that's a Labor government process. The former government's been there for 9 years. In 2017, after the Uluru Statement from the Heart, they set up the process of the Joint Parliamentary Committee that reported. They then set up the Karma-Langton process that reported on detail. This is about two things: recognition and consultation. That's what it's about. People know that that's what it's about. I was asked to outline what a draft might look like. It was said, we don't know what the question is even like. I did that last July and outlined a draft clause that's very clear in recognition of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders as Australia's first peoples. 1, there shall be a voice. 2, it shall be able to make representations on matters that affect Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And 3, the functions and structure, etc. of the voice would be determined by the Parliament. That's the whole point here. It's subservient to the Parliament. This is such a gracious and generous request. And people can choose to try to spread misinformation or pretend that they don't know about issues which are so clear, even though they all know. It won't have a right of veto, it won't be a funding body, it won't run programs, it's not going to sit around the cabinet table. It is just a request for consultation. Good manners, the way that I was brought up. If I'm going to have an impact on you, then you go and ask. If the press gallery is about to change its structure and knock down the Australian Bureau and move it somewhere else, chances are someone would come in and tell you that and say, what do you think? You know, it is not too much to ask. And I'm very hopeful that, that the Australian people will vote to recognise First Nations people in our Constitution, to show them that respect. And I note today, wasn't splashed anywhere, but today the significance of faith leaders, Catholics, Anglicans, Muslims, Hindu, Buddhist leaders putting a joint statement pleading for support for the voice and support for constitutional recognition was, in my view, incredibly significant, because it was them putting forward their values proposition, just as sporting organisations, the business community and others, all the trade union movement, are all backing so strongly in civil society this change.
Kieran Gilbert.
Prime Minister, you said you want to reach across the aisle over the voice. I might have something that might help you with it. Father Frank Brennan, respected Jesuit priest, professor in law, a huge advocate for Indigenous Australians. He very strong supporter of the voice, but he does not believe that the draft amendment, you said it was a draft, is watertight legally. He's put forward in this book, he's released this week, an Indigenous voice to Parliament, considering a constitutional bridge. He believes a tighter and a clearer amendment that he thinks is watertight. you've got this Senate committee kicking off next month. It's going to receive public submissions like Father Frank's. You said it's a draft. Are you open to change?
We've actually got a constitutional working group that is working through these issues, including former High Court Judge Justice Hayne, including Professor Toomey, a range of constitutional experts, all working through these issues. Father Frank Brennan he is a friend of mine. He has my utmost respect, and he's someone who is a very good person and actually sat on. The thing about this process is on the Karma Langton review, wasn't just Karma Langton. Professor Brennan was a part of it. Chris Kenny, a whole range of people were a part of that process as well, that came and fed into the Karma Langton review as well. I think that the advice and with due respect to Frank, who does have my respect on legal matters, I look at the article in the Australian Financial Review by the former Chief Justice French was, in my view, a really clear outline of why these issues are very, very tight in the draft wording which is there. But I'm open to, I don't have a closed mind on these things, but I think that the constitutional working group that's been established is working through these issues as well.
Thank you.
Catherine Murphy.
Hello, PM. I just want to return to AUKUS if I can, and sovereignty, which has been a major feature of your speech today. Now, military history gives us plenty of examples where the interests of Australia and a major security ally have not aligned. John Curtin thrashed that out at the Lodge during World War II on a number of occasions. So my question is quite simple. In relation to nuclear submarines, if there is a conflict between the United States, the United Kingdom and ourselves about where these assets would be deployed during a conflict, we might have different views about where they should be. Who is the decision maker? Is it us, or is it not? Or is it more muddy than that? Because will it require concurrence? Because there'll need to be oversight, operational oversight of these vessels by either the UK or the US.
Australia will maintain our sovereignty.
In all circumstances?
Australia will maintain our sovereignty. That's a decision for Australia as a sovereign nation, just as the United States will maintain its sovereignty and the United Kingdom will maintain its.
Andrew Probyn.
Prime Minister, further to Kieran's question, as you're well aware, there's a bit of a debate about the inclusion of executive government in the proposed wording. And there's views for and against, including the views of Frank Brennan. My good colleagues, Patricia Karvelis and Fran Kelly, had the Minister for Indigenous Australians on their podcast earlier this week. And on that, Linda Burney said, there will be a voice, not to the government, but a voice to the Parliament. Are we to conclude from that statement that a decision has been made to remove executive government from that proposed amendment?
No.
Claire.
Can you explain it?
You ask us a question, I gave a very straight answer.
Claire,
no, we haven't determined. There's a process here. Again, it's not my decision. There's a process of working this through. And one of the things I've said to the members who sit opposite is they're participants in this process. I want to bring as many people as possible on this journey. That's my starting point, very clearly. Now, I don't know the context in which you've said that. I'm aware that there is a view over whether it be executive government or government. Those things will be worked through. You will have in March the presentation of legislation to the Parliament. It will be moved in the Parliament. There will then be a parliamentary committee process allowing people to have all of the input, and every person, either a legal expert or someone who thinks they're a legal expert, will be able to make submissions to that process. I am not being prescriptive. I have never been prescriptive. I want this to happen. Australia needs this to happen, but it's not my process.
Claire Armstrong.
Thanks, Prime Minister. Claire Armstrong from News Corp Australia. Just back on AUKUS, even if Australia doesn't develop a nuclear energy industry, do you believe the country will have to significantly expand its nuclear capacity in terms of investment in nuclear research and science, even beyond the capabilities needed to handle the AUKUS subs?
Some of the research you're seeing stepped up already at places like University of New South Wales, but also with part of AUKUS, I know the focus is on very much on the subs issue, but it's about more than that. Part of what will occur as well is increased, when we talk about interoperability, we're talking about greater exchanges as well and greater knowledge build up. So one of the things that we're conscious of is that in order to, as well, to back up the assurance of sovereignty, we'll be building up our capacity, not just in terms of capability, in terms of things that are metal and shiny. Our human capability is really important as well, and our capacity, and that's very much a part of our focus and our thinking.
Chloe Boris.
Thank you, Prime Minister. Just following on Mike Burgess's speech from last night, I understand that your cabinet ministers have been...
Can I flick it to Mike's?
This one's for you. I understand your cabinet ministers have been directed not to text each other anymore, but instead to use encrypted service Signal. Is that to stop their communications being intercepted by foreign powers?
Well, I got about half a dozen text messages today from colleagues, including Dr. Lee, and including people who are here telling me they were looking forward to it. So if that's a directive, they're not doing very well.
But what was the purpose of that directive, though? Was it to stop foreign interference?
I'm just dismissing the so-called directive. I'm saying I got text messages today, about half a dozen, from Dr. Lee. I have had a range of text messages and phone calls from people. I even got a couple from journalists today. So, you know, like we are conscious about some issues of security, obviously, but I assure you that there are no penalties. No one will be dropped from the Cabinet for the crime of sending a text message.
Katina Curtis.
Which will be of some relief to people in this room.
Thanks. Katina Curtis from the West Australian. Just picking up on your answer to David Crowe earlier, where you said that there are things that you would like to do in the budget context, but you haven't been able to. If you hear back from your Economic Inclusion Advisory Panel and they say you need to raise the dole rate by this much, and you go back to them and say, well, we'd love to, but we just can't, what does that do for your good faith relationship with David Pocock?
Well, we have a good relationship with David Pocock and with anyone who wants to engage with us. I think it's a pity that the Coalition have taken themselves out of any forums of having any influence over safeguards, over Housing Australia Future Fund, over National Reconstruction Fund, over the budget processes. Why you would do that is beyond me, but that's a decision for them. That means that in terms of carrying resolution through the Senate, we will continue to engage in good faith. I'm someone who engages in good faith with people I keep confidences, and I also, what you see is what you get with me as well, and I have a constructive relationship with David Pocock, as I do with all of the crossbenchers who I meet with regularly, and don't meet with them just because of a voting pattern. I met last week with all of the crossbenchers in the House of Representatives, as I do regularly, in order to exchange ideas. We don't pretend that we're a government that has, you know, can just decide things without engaging. So whether it be engaging with other members of Parliament, engaging with the business community, engaging with civil society, engaging with the unions, we're up for it. It's a process of inclusive government, which is one of the things that we're doing, and members of Parliament are front and centre in that.
Charles Croucher.
G'day, PM. To go back to Mike Burgess' speech last night, he said there were senior figures both in business and elsewhere that were questioning whether ASIO was doing the right thing by standing up against some of those powers that were trying to interfere with Australia. What would your message be to those that are pushing back against ASIO?
That ASIO is doing the right thing and that they have the support of my government in all of their actions.
Great. Thank you.
Maeve Bannister.
Thanks, Prime Minister. Maeve Bannister from AAP. On the AUKUS partnership, President Marcos from the Philippines told you he felt his country was akin to being outsiders looking in when he met you at the APEC summit in November. How are you working through concerns about the partnership with other regional partners that they hold while you're also progressing the Security Pact?
Yeah. Well, I've been invited by President Marcos to the Philippines, as I've been invited to Malaysia and other countries in the region. In the last fortnight, when Parliament was sitting, we had the senior ministers, including the Foreign Minister of PNG and a whole team, have a ministerial engagement. We had the Foreign Minister and Defence Minister of Indonesia. Separately, we had General Luhut, who I'm not sure what his title is in Indonesia. He has a big title, but he's a pretty senior player in the Indonesian government, and one I enjoy a very good relationship with. We invited and had the Prime Minister of Vanuatu for an official visit. We had the Prime Minister of New Zealand here. We have the Crown Prince of Tonga here today. We have, I think, an unprecedented level of engagement. I had the Foreign Minister of India on Saturday. Friday, in 2 days' time, I'm meeting a senior European business leader as well, a part of just all of our engagement. We're engaging, we're being really upfront about where we're headed. We're engaging in a positive way, and I think all of our ministers as well are engaging. It's not just at Prime Ministerial level, or not just the Foreign Minister Penny Wong or Defence Minister Richard Marles. Pat Conroy, the work that he's done in the Pacific is quite extraordinary. And the truth is that the former government dropped the ball on international relations. I'm not quite sure how they got it quite so wrong in order to be in a situation whereby as I meet with world leaders, they are very clear about the change in tone and policy and cooperation that my government has. And part of that is, of course, our arrangements that are out there for all to see. And they're very positive, and they're being received, our relations are being received in a very positive way, particularly in the region. We'll host ASEAN leaders here in a period not too far away, not this year, but we're also engaging. We'll have the Quad leaders meeting here. We'll have bilateral meetings here, including President Widodo. I will visit India on the 8th of March, along with 25 at least senior CEOs of major resource, education, finance sector, businesses as well. That will be a very significant gathering indeed at the invitation of Prime Minister Modi, and I think our relations in the region have never been stronger.
Thank you.
Ben Westcott, Bloomberg. Thank you so much, Prime Minister, for your speech. Speaking of warming relations, ties with China have improved since your government came to power 9 or so months ago. One thing that the Chinese government and its representatives have made very clear they'd be interested in going forward is more foreign investment in Australia, and the Chinese ambassador mentioned lithium as an area of potential cooperation. Would you be interested in seeing more Chinese foreign investment in Australia and in the critical minerals sector?
Well, we'll deal with issues of foreign investment according to the merits of any proposal. But can I say this as well? Australia has very much a direct interest in making more things here and improving our sovereign capability. That's my starting point. And so, but we'll deal with any applications in a mature, reasonable way. That's the right thing to do. But I am very conscious as well about Australia's sovereign capabilities and being protected. Rare earths and critical minerals are part of the National Reconstruction Fund, is about taking those things here, providing financing for Australian-based businesses to invest in value add here. Why aren't we making more batteries here? We have almost half of the world's lithium deposits. You know, I was in Perth and Port Hedland yesterday. If you went to Port Hedland, as I did, you know, I've been there many times, but 20 years ago, no one would have been coming up to you and saying, hi, I'm a lithium company. They were queuing up. There were more lithium companies represented at the there were 150 RSVPs at the reception we did at Port Hedland. I'm certain there were, without doing a head count, there were over 200 people there. And lithium has an extraordinary capacity. We need to not just dig it up. I want to make sure that we use the lithium and nickel and other products that we have to make batteries here. That's part of the vision of protecting our national economy going forward. I think we should be making solar panels here. I think we should be making so many more things here in order to protect our national sovereignty.
Our last question today is going to be from Karen Barlow.
Thank you, Prime Minister. Karen Barlow from the Canberra Times. I want to take you beyond AUKUS in talking about the future challenges for the Defence Force to people. There have been dire warnings for years about defence recruitment, and in the national security space we heard from Mike Burgess last night talking about how strapped ASIO is in regards to espionage and foreign interference. Is this an impossible challenge for Defence, for the security agencies, for the government to keep up with the recruitment requirements for this country? You know, what's being done, even in the short term, medium term?
No is the simple answer, because it can't be. We can't be overwhelmed by what's before us. We need to be clear-eyed about the challenges that are ahead, and yes, without going into all of the detail, we have been clear-eyed about agencies being able to recruit to meet their needs. The Defence Force is the same. These are good, secure jobs. These provide an opportunity to be engaged in really interesting work, and to have, I think, the sense of self-satisfaction that comes with making a contribution beyond yourself to the nation. And I have the utmost respect for every man and woman who goes into the Australian Defence Force. It's been a great honour as Prime Minister to meet many of them, and you know, the young people who took me into, if there was a moment that, you know, that really hit home, it was the people who took me into Kyiv at a time when the security risk had been increased in the week in which I headed in there, and people whose job it was, and I was conscious that if something happened there, because it was, the briefing was pretty clear about what their job was. And that's a really humbling experience, you know, and I think that we do need to value and to respect and to praise those men and women who put their lives on the line in uniform to defend our nation. And we need to recognise as well that in today's modern world, that mightn't necessarily just be in the traditional form that you would think. It's people who are working for ASIO, working at ASD, working with ACES, undertaking the various tasks in our national security framework. So they have my utmost respect. We'll provide them with what resources are required, and it's an absolute priority of my government.
Please thank the Prime Minister.